welcome to the Hunch Voice. My name is Emma, a growth marketer here at Hunch, and today on the Hunch Voice we'll circle up the story of localization on paid social and conclude why is it important to go from local to social in today's paid social space. With insights from Sinisa Rakovic, the CEO of Hunch, and Nebojsa Knezevic, Hunch's head of product. Siki and Eps, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Great to have.
Thanks for having us.
For those of you who don't know us, Hunch is a meta business partner, and we're heavily involved in the space of creative enhancement as well as campaign automation on paid social. So previously we've talked about online media not being about buying advertising space, though it's about getting the user's attention. That any personalization gives you a better fighting chance in the social space for reach, exposure, and engagement. And of course, better usage of engagement means lower cost and higher impact. And after running hundreds of successful campaigns, saving months in creative production and launch, and working with some of the best brands in the industry, in our experience, automated ad localization has proven to be the key to winning over customers and hitting performance goals. So, Siki, tell me your experience with localization. How does localization influence the industry, and why is it so important nowadays?
Well, any types of contextualization, if you look at localization, falls under a broader sort of umbrella of personalization, right? So we want to personalize, communication strategies. Localization is one way to personalize, right? Or one way to create context for the actual end user. And so what we've seen as we're working with lots of different brands and different verticals is that one of the core strategies for 2022, at least, in large part due to sort of loss of signals from iOS 14, 15, and Google and cookies and so forth, is bringing national communication strategies down to the local level. And so that comes in lots of different flavors and lots of different sort of forms, but it's one of the things that brands are focusing on that they see, working, right? And there's plenty of different, examples that, we can explore and look at. But obviously the main, driver of that is how do you grab attention and how do you actually do that at scale, right? So if we had a magic wand and say, hey, how can we grab attention from our users today in this sort of, in a social channels where attention is really hard to get, right? Is being contextual, is being personal in a certain way, and location is a great example of that.
Mm-hmm, great. And what does localization do for these brands? How to translate the value and impact of location-based ads to a simple company or client? Like how to put localization on social, and how does Hunch help advertising in doing that?
Yeah, so depends on the actual advertiser, right? It depends on the actual use case. But we've seen lots of different examples from energy companies in the UK or in Europe, to meal kit delivery companies, to last mile delivery companies, right? Retail and so forth. It's that sort of blend of national and local, or in another aspect, combining sort of branding with performance campaigns, right? And that's actually where they meet. Is when you take branding and you sort of bring it down to local level. The question is, how do you localize? Let's say you have hundreds of different cities or neighborhoods that you want to localize. How do you do that without spending an arm and a leg and on your creative? So let's say you have to produce 500 videos that are speaking the local language, for example. So let's just take one example that we've had is a global brand that has 26 different markets, right? A telco, for example, that has 26 different markets. It has 4 or 5 different core offerings, and within those core offerings are actually hundreds of different products that they're offering. So you take hundreds of products and you take 20 different markets, and those products change on a weekly basis. The way they actually get the attention is to communicate that and say, present it both in cultural, in music, in products, in communicating the actual city on the video or the image itself, combining both product and location and so forth. So the question is, how do you do that at scale, right? How can you, if you know that it works, if we had a magic wand, obviously we would want to have as much context in our messaging as possible for that moment of time when that person is purchasing that product, right? We know that works. And so one of the biggest problems in brands is, the reason why they don't actually do that today is because it's a lot of work. And the question is, who's going to do that work, right? Is it the actual in-house brand team? Is it the media team? Is it the creative agency team? Who will actually take and explode sort of the business logic to have it be localized? And so that's what we've seen, is that brands are sort of leaning on platforms to scale their messaging and ultimately have better performance of that.
We understand that it's important and that it affects the industry. So, Nebs, could you tell us why aren't advertisers doing this? Why aren't we seeing that more of localized ads?
So yeah, broadly speaking, we have like brands that have importance in location, which is really down to ground matter of location, as Ziggy mentioned, like meal kit delivery services, where it's a matter of like, we deliver in 10 minutes. So you have to be hyper precise within that location, which is 10 minutes. You might have something such as an e-com brand, which is global, which is just trying to like manage the pricing across different regions and whatnot. And then at the end, you have that cultural moment which is, how do different markets communicate? So you might have like different holidays, or you might have something as different popular personalities used in those ads and whatnot. So the challenge with all of that is managing all that creative. Like it's not just a matter of production, but if we take a look at like simple example, which is like have 5 locations. So if you're running your campaign on Facebook, if you have 5 different locations, that probably means that you have to create around 15 creatives, which doesn't sound as much. But if you have anything that's like changing through time, it might be prices, it might be discounts and whatnot, that means that every time that there's a change, there's 15 creative assets that have to get produced. And actually what happens is like, if you're on your media team, you send the request to creative team who creates 15 creatives, they give back to you, you give feedback, upload that to Facebook, upload into campaign and whatnot. So that's a lot of work. And because the traditional approach to media is such, sometimes it's hard to like justify the cost with the effect. So we know that there's the effect of localization, and we know the numbers, how much localization brings to performance, but are those numbers big enough when you already have a bulky organization? That's a big question, and that's where we try to kind of step in and help our users scale their strategy.
So I was going to add to that when you think of the capabilities that brands have today, sort of shortening that loop of looking at what's actually working and actually delivering that to the local level, that latency has traditionally been very long, right? Yeah. So it takes maybe weeks or months to do that, right? So I think today, when you have the data feedback loop of what's working broadly across different markets, and then feeding that into the, let's say the centralized command center, or sort of the engine that drives, the growth, that has become shorter. And so I think what a lot of brands are doing is they're looking for ways to, first of all, create a much faster decisioning feedback loop of saying, if this worked, how can we drop that down to each single location across 27 different markets, right? And so creating that, sort of almost like a live, right?
Yeah, that cycle is like, it's really interesting because in the essence you have your data, which kind of informs the creative. Whatever data you have will go into the creative. And then again, that same data should power your media decisioning. So you have your data on users and user behavior and whatnot. So all those 2 of those have to come together. Now, if you manage to do that in a sort of centralized way where you're easily feeding back that data back into creative and then informing media, with that you really get like constant uptick in performance, incremental uptick in performance if you're able to do that.
Yeah, so if you see like something working in one market, right? Taking that strategy and then bringing it down to every single market is now, sort of a matter of minutes, right? So it would take like, 5 minutes to update 26 different markets with maybe, maybe not 5 minutes,
yeah.
But let's say, definitely, less than, a week.
Less than a week, yeah.
Yeah, so it would be like a day or to update the entire sort of strategy and include that for all the different locations, right? And so previously, let's say how that would happen, in the Mad Men era, right? It would be like, they would get the feedback loop after 6 months, and they would say, okay, Lau, let's update this in every single market, and then they drop that down to the agency.
Yeah, and that data is...
would take another 2 weeks, and the approvals for another 2 weeks. So I think it's really important that the concept of when we talk about going national to local, the sort of underlining agenda there is to keep it live, and to have that,
yeah, otherwise you're optimizing on outdated data, which...
Yeah.
And also looking at the creative, like the problem with that, why people aren't doing it, so why you employ creatives in your marketing teams. And the thing that the creative guys are good at is being creative, not being production efficient. So imagine, like, even if you try to do that in a traditional way, where you try to get that data back in and whatnot, you would just get a bunch of creative people constantly updating the ads and doing nothing else but updating the ads, which is wasteful of a resource which could be focused on creative, which could be focused on figuring out why does this layout work better than this layout, and so on, so forth. So offloading that part of production heavy stuff into automated creative systems really lets you work with your creatives in a creative way, and not just, and then looking for production efficiencies on the other end of things, rather than like trying to speed up your creative team, which is like no creative team likes that.
Having said all that, Nebs, could you tell us what's the general solution to localization problems, and how can Hunch users or future Hunch users approach this?
So as we mentioned, like, the idea is that your data informs your creative, and your data is also basis for your media buy. To get that to like a functional level, what this means is Hunch allows you to turn your data into creative. You gather your campaign information, let's say the list of locations, you build your creatives and let the system do its work, which is kind of like simple way of putting the capabilities of a platform which builds dynamic creatives, which allows you to build dynamic videos and whatnot. But at its core, the idea is you're using the platform to both produce the creatives in an automated way, but also to manage your campaigns in an automated way, while you're sitting in your, like, on one side, you're sitting in your data control center where you control the data which is going in, and on the other side of things, you have creatives who are trying to build the best possible design.
Mm-hmm. And could you give us some examples of Hunch users doing localization, and does that influence their campaigns?
So I think one of the best examples we have, and which we really loved, is like when you speak about location, sometimes being really, really hyper-targeted is important. And once you hyper-target, that means you're getting a huge number of creatives. So our client, Rockboxy, through their agency, General, approached Hunch and decided to see if they can improve what they're doing through localization. So the idea is basically they are selling meal-ready kits, which you can order and they can be delivered to your address. And what they figured out was like that having that specific location is really important to focus on users that can actually get the meals. So they approached Hunch. We helped them build a solution to automate their production and campaign processes. And kind of, it's hard to compare results, but like they did generic creative and then they did localized. And a couple of things happened. One is like they took less time to launch hyper-localized campaigns than they used to do to launch a generic campaign, which is like insane. That hyper-localized campaign had like 140 locations, so almost 500 different ads, and so on and so forth. And yet it took less time to go live than the generic campaign. And of course, the other thing, which you can see in the numbers, is that the campaign performance far outperformed the generic campaign. So that's a really, really good example of why when your product, when it's important for your business that something is local, let your users know that it's local.
And what about G Adventures?
So G Adventures is an interesting case because they're a global travel agency. So at that point, we're talking about a client which is not strictly like location-based. It's not a matter of are we delivering to your address and whatnot. But their offer has to be contextualized by the location you're in. So it's either different locations that are accessible or different pricing and whatnot. So that's a lot of work in terms of management. Like you're managing 6 continents, to say the least. That's the minimum split we're looking at. And trying to figure out like what campaigns work where. Each of the locations has its own cultural specifics. Each of them has their offering specifics. So what they did is they approached Hunch with all the data that they have. It was interesting because it was a client that approached us during the first years of COVID. So it was really challenging for them. Their team was smaller than it was. So like literally 1/5 of a team was able to manage all the campaigns that they were running and retain some performance, but it also opened up additional stuff for them, such as they started exploring video campaigns, specific locations campaigns and whatnot. So their advertising grew more diverse. It just goes to show you is like once you get that manual labor out of the way. Once you get management of all the locations, all the feed and everything, once you get that out of the way, it allows you to grow your marketing strategies in more than one way. So it's not just a matter of localizing, it's a matter of, as Iggy mentioned, like what formats do work? Do we have to produce video for this? Do we want to use like slideshows and whatnot? So once you move that out of the way, you can really get creative.
So as the takeaway, let's talk about why is localization the best solution for brands' problems and why should they do it through Hunch?
Yeah, I would say it's one of approaches, right? It's not the only approach. I think a brand should definitely be looking at all the possibilities of how to communicate more effectively with their customers and their customer base. But if you explore different verticals or different cases, Neb's mentioned a couple cases there in terms of travel and sort of meal kit deliveries. But if you think of like retail, for example, people are coming back. In general, there is a trend from what Google says as far as near me searches, right? So people are looking for localized offers, right? And especially now as things get, let's call it quote unquote, back to normal, as people start going back to retail in terms of shopping. It's how do you differentiate your messaging amongst all the other ones. And I think localizing the offer, right, whether it's product at that specific store, in that specific location, in that specific language.
Great. Thank you, Siki and Nebs, for sharing your insights with us. And thank you guys for staying with us, and hope this was valuable and that by now you're fully aware of the benefits of localized campaigns in today's highly competitive and tension economy. And you could actually be next. Hop on a free strategy consultation to find out how to leverage localization to do it the right way for your brand. Our customer success team is ready. And make sure to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for more new content. Follow us on LinkedIn and also subscribe to our weekly newsletter for more new content every week. Bye!